Well, it's great to be here, actually in person, and to see all of you in the flesh. I feel like I should start with the caveat that I feel like this summer kind of went in fits and starts, and I'm hoping that what I am providing, is helpful to you guys. But as I'll say again at the end, one of the nice things is I feel like this is not a goodbye. This is an ongoing relationship, hopefully. And so a lot of what I'm going to present, I'm hoping to kind of hone some of the ideas that I talked about the last time I talked a few weeks ago, and maybe, hopefully, hone them into a few more kind of actionable things. I've actually changed some of my recommendations from before, so this will hopefully just be a conversation about kind of just moving forward. All right. This is just a reminder of what I said at the beginning of the summer in June, what my goals were. I think that the one big thing that I didn't get to do, unfortunately, was talk to people from SLDSs. That being said, I am going to be talking to them in a few weeks. But I do think I was able to get some insight, learned a lot about how OpenDP works, and so I have a lot more information when I talk to them. I think it boils down to two kind of primary questions that I ended up asking this summer. The first one was looking at the resources, the tools, the documentation that you guys have, kind of the universe of OpenDP, and thinking about, like, can these be used by the audiences that I work with at the SLDSs? These are education data for folks who don't remember. And then the second thing is the functionality, like how would it actually work if people try to, crack open the code and plug it in. So I've kind of baked this into a couple like recommendations, and like I said, this is hopefully kind of honing some of the stuff I talked about before with a few additional ideas. So thinking about the resources, I had mentioned this last time when I presented. I think right now there's a lot of different ways of using the OpenDP toolkit, and I think for people coming to the website, there needs to be more of a roadmap. And I think in particular, having clearer documentation distinguishing the framework from the context API would be really helpful. Right now it's structured in a way that you kind of walk through different queries or different concepts of adding noise, and there's these like nested examples of how you would do it with the framework, how you do it with the context. And I'm not sure that's really kind of the right target for people, because it's almost like a step past their first question, which is like, what will I even use when I walk in the door? And so I think kind of separating those documentations out entirely, and then kind of streamlining things. Like one thing I just actually noticed in the last week as I was tinkering is, like, the typical workflow page, which is your first page on the documentation, doesn't actually work if you then try to plug in some of the examples from the second page, which use polars. And so this is, I think it goes back to kind of that disconnect between the ways some of this stuff has developed, and how with the context API you're leaning really heavily on polars, which I think is really helpful, and that's good for users. But basically, like, separating that out and making it really clear to people. And maybe honestly even, like, the framework API, maybe partitioning that off into a different part of the documentation entirely, just because the way people are going to be using, like the people who are going to want to use that, I think are very different from the people who are going to want to use the context API. And so rather than it being kind of an either or, like have some kind of gateway that's like funneling people in the direction that's going to be most useful for them. Happy to talk more about, like I said, we can talk now, or I can also go quickly, so Barrett has time for his presentation.
My presentation is very short.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it will be fine.
As long as you don't have to run, as long as you don't have a hard stop.
No, I don't have a hard stop.
Lunch a little bit.
Genuinely, I did a lot of engineering work and almost no algorithm work, so I truly have a short presentation.
Yeah.
Okay,
Don't
okay.
worry about
I
it.
think we will be fine. Barrett had it seconds, so
Okay.
Like, it's going to be short.
Yeah.
Well, feel free to jump in. If not, we can obviously continue over lunch.
Yeah.
On the wizard, so this is actually one thing where I've kind of, in the last 2 weeks, changed my mind from what I said 2 weeks ago. Well, I guess I'll get to that. I think the wizard, one of the things that's confusing right now is the way it's presented is kind of like, you can use the API or you can use the wizard. But the reality is the functionality is not one-to-one. And so I think either, and in conversations with you guys, it seems like the wizard is not, there's not a lot of maintenance planned for it. So potentially moving it to, I think, an archive status could be helpful, just from a clarity standpoint in terms of like what are really the tools that you guys are promoting. Or, and this is the change, last time we talked about, kind of a simulation tool, and I had brought up this idea of kind of developing a repository where people can submit simulation tools. Actually thought about it some more, and I think that the wizard actually could be repurposed. And I think, I haven't seen the code under the hood, but I think at least from my impression, it looks like you could probably just change the output from a single draw to a simulated distribution, and maybe you could have it give you visuals or common accuracy measures. And what you could do is actually not let users upload data, so you don't need to worry about someone accidentally using it for privatizing their statistics, which they shouldn't be doing if you're giving, especially if you're giving them distribution. But you could basically have a repository of common data sets with different types of features, different numbers of rows, like different things that would kind of cover different use cases. And then you could even allow kind of requests to add different public data sets to the repo so that someone could come. And this way it wouldn't be like we talked about last time with like people building their own tools for different content, like different applications, which might get messy, especially if they're not implementing it correctly. This would allow you to control the implementation of the noise addition. But people could basically request like, hey, this data set would be really interesting for me to play around with to understand the impact of differential privacy. Can I get that added to the wizard? And then it's an option that they can select. And the nice thing is that like the wizard already provides this interface for exploring a lot of the decisions that I think people will want to explore, like what happens when you choose more statistics and you split your budget more across those statistics? What happens when you change your budget? What happens when you use different types of statistics? What about these different assumptions? Like that stuff's already in the interface largely, and so I think that's a lot of what people are going to want to explore in terms of understanding, how the application of DP might impact the statistics on the type of data that they're interested in. So that's kind of my new idea. Potentially also less work and kind of more within kind of the domain of what you guys are already doing. So if there is money, I suppose, to work on the wizard, that's one way you could take it. Going back to the documentation review, I know I said this last time, but again, tried to hone it a little bit more. I think, again, one of the things about the documentation that might be difficult for folks who are coming in with kind of less of a background is right now the documentation is very heavily focused on queries, so you kind of walk through like here's how you would do a count, here's how you do a mean, here's how you do a median, but there's not really any one kind of example code that goes from start to finish, and I think for the folks I'm thinking about, like that kind of very straightforward like here's how you do the whole thing would be helpful. And you could either kind of replace or kind of create a new parallel version of the working with tabular data documentation. Like right now that walks through a bunch of different things that I think you could basically just string together into one kind of cohesive set of documentation that talks about kind of like, how do you set your inputs? How do you, pay attention to your data types and how that has an impact on which noise mechanisms are going to be chosen under the hood, and how do you choose your privacy loss, and how do you choose your margins? Like right now, this is all kind of split across a bunch of different pages, and so like tying it all together for a user in like one cohesive walkthrough, I think will be really helpful for people to pick it up quicker. And then kind of within that, I mentioned this last time, but I think like it's you could provide links to specific API documentation if people want to like dive deeper into specific functions. Yeah.
I think the current documentation for getting started is starting to feel more like API documentation. And so maybe like you said, the right surface for a user to start with is just a demo with the labor data that does everything at once. And,
yeah.
You can see the whole process. And then maybe cleave off what we have into the deeper API docs.
Yeah. Yeah. No, totally. And there is, I have notes that I can go back through and try to give you specific places, but there are a couple places in the API, like buried in the API documentation, where there's like really useful tidbits. So trying to kind of surface those and bring those out into that demo, I think would also be helpful. So you could kind of see it both ways. And I'll try to flag a couple of those important ones that I found.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know
Yeah.
what gems are heading.
Yeah. Off the top of my head, I think at least one of them with the way like the summarize function works. I think some of like the interesting stuff with what you can do with that is actually buried in the API documentation and not at that top level. I think there might be another one, but anyways, I'll take those out of my notes and share them. And I think this kind of dovetails into, one thing that I was trying to kind of like conceptualize in my head, and then I thought would be helpful to kind of present, when thinking about, so like we use the word like end-to-end DP, and I think sometimes that means different things to different communities. So I was thinking about like from a user's perspective, at least the types of users I work with, kind of like what is the actual pipeline? Because it involves a lot more than actually the application of DP. Like at the beginning, there's like, okay, we're gonna actually determine what we're releasing, right? Like how many statistics, what types of statistics, what are the group bys, like what are these tables we're envisioning, what are they gonna look like? And right now, like that's really happening pre-OpenDP, and hopefully happening with auxiliary data. And then, maybe they're thinking of like, if they're going to use OpenDP, then they're like, okay, now I have to use this context compositor to, set my privacy loss definition and my budget and, set up basically like what I'm going to do. But the reality is that, like, when they get to that step 2, they haven't actually fully made the decisions about step 1. There's really this iterative process of then saying, okay, now given a particular privacy loss budget that I'm going to split across these statistics that I want to release, now I'm going to like do some work, thinking about interpreting my privacy guarantee, thinking about what this actually means, for the types of statistics, the number of statistics I'm releasing, for the like specific, per attribute budget or whatever. Like there's lots of different ways that people might want to try to dive deeper into interpreting the privacy guarantee than just interpreting the top level total value. And then they're also going to like definitely want to simulate the impact on the types of statistics, and again, hopefully not doing it with their actual data, but again, like they kind of have to have the information in step 2 in order to do step 3s, which then is going to go back and inform step 1 again, because they might say, oh, actually, we can't release that number of statistics with that privacy guarantee because we're not getting the level of accuracy we want, or vice versa, potentially. And so I think right now, the way OpenDP is structured, like, that's not really the way you guys want it to work, right? Like, you don't want someone to, like, iterate on the context compositor. It's just, like, not, it's a weird way to use that API. But I think, like, the reality is that that is what people will probably want to do. And then, of course, like there's running the queries, and then there's like the post-OpenDP, like taking the outputs and refactoring them. And I think that's not like as big of an issue. But I think that iterative step is the trickiest part of saying, like we've got to make all these decisions, and the way the code is set up right now, it ends up with you, maybe like with the user, like iterating on something that they really shouldn't be iterating on. And so I think the question, like, in my mind is like right now, from the types of stuff I'm thinking about, like OpenDP is good building block software, but it's not like something that someone's going to pick up and just like use for their whole, like if you think about that pipeline I just showed, they're not going to use it for all of those steps, and they're not going to necessarily know like where to plug OpenDP into all of those steps. And actually, I thought it was great that I saw Damien posted on the Slack like something that like totally ties into what I was going to talk about, which is basically like the reality is that I think people are like gonna build around OpenDP right now. Like they're not going to just use the tools you guys have created. Like they're gonna like try to like build their own patchwork around it. And I think he was also talking about maybe a more extreme example where they're like, you know, building like lots of other stuff. But I think even in the simple example where someone's adding, you know, straightforward noise to simple statistics, like they're going to build around it in terms of those like iterative steps that I was talking about. And they're going to, you know, they might use the context model, they might like grab one of the like, you know, APIs out of the framework just to like do their noise sampling. But either way, they're going to add like their own preprocessing or simulations or other stuff on top of it. And so I think it's kind of like, oh, well, I put recommendation TBD because I'm curious to kind of talk about all this with my SLDS partners and see what they say. But at least from my perspective, like I think OpenDP probably should decide whether your goal is to try to manage all of that other stuff or just kind of focus on like giving really good guidance for how to appropriately plug OpenDP into that bigger process. And so one idea, this is kind of the last thing I was going to say, is, you know, maybe a repository of like reproducible code using OpenDP is actually a really good way to go. Mike sent me this notebook that Shlomi and Marcel did just a few months ago, which I had missed, but I think that's a great example, right? Of here's what, you know, like they have an actual data set, they have an actual problem they're trying to solve, and then there's like actual code you can see in there of how they implemented OpenDP. And, you know, I'm planning on creating one with the ed data once I talk to some of these partners. But basically, like, if you require it to not just be kind of like toy examples, but like full pipelines that involve like these bigger level decisions that have to be made, and then explicitly show how OpenDP plugs into that. And if you target Python and R, like I think that could start to really help people see their projects using OpenDP if they can see examples of where it fits in. And I think that's probably more obtainable. Like I don't think you really want to go the route of like trying to do literally everything, because that's probably unrealistic, and like probably not. Like you guys have really strong strengths in the very like the core elements of the DP, right? And I don't know that you are interested in getting into all of the rest of the stuff. Maybe you are, but yeah. So that's kind of like my last point. And like I said, you know, final presentation, but not goodbye. I have a couple meetings set up in the coming weeks, so maybe I'll update or add recommendations based on those feedback. And like I said, you know, definitely happy to continue, you know, talking and working with you guys, providing additional feedback on, you know, things like documentations or this idea of repurposing the wizard or the reproducible code repo. And yeah, it's been great. It's, like I said, it's been great to actually be in Boston. So it's good to be here. Thanks for listening.
Do you think that, like, with the adjustments that we talked about, like better tooling for interpreting privacy laws, better tooling for looking at what the accuracy of queries can be given public data, that the library would be better. Yeah, this basically.
The parts where I wrote in development, yeah,
both line up very, very nicely with things we talked about.
Yeah. And that's what I was thinking when I put in development about our conversations.
How close does that get us to handling the DP pipeline for the typical DP user? Like, is there a lot more beyond that you want to?
So yeah,
adoption for?
I think maybe there's two different questions that you're getting at least in my mind. So the first one is more of a from a policy, like designing your project standpoint. I think that if you had kind of if you combined the repurposing the DP wizard into a simulation tool where people can get a sense of, you know, the impact based on selections on data that has the same schema or looks like the type of data that they're going to be working with. That will get you a long way in doing this kind of iterative thing, because that's going to help them answer a lot of those questions. And then I think the only tricky part is that, like, I still can imagine someone feeling confident about that, and then they create their context, and then they do these steps 3 and 3B with the new stuff, and they see it and they think like, oh, that's actually not quite what I wanted, right? And so I don't, like, maybe that's just what it is. Like, I don't know if there's a better way to do it. But I think the iteration feels like the clunky part. So somehow getting away from iteration. Again, I'm not sure if that's like a different, like maybe there's like a like a module before you create your context or something. Yeah. But then I think there's the second question of, you know, like conceptually, like very practically, how do people, you know, do this in their code? And I think that's where, if there's examples and, you know, this stuff that you're developing is fleshed out, then I think, yeah, that gets you there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in practice, it is really nice to be able to build a context and see how it fails and then go back and rebuild it because.
Yeah.
But it's also, like, from a library perspective, providing a module to rebuild the context for you feels like it's kind of normalizing or endorsing a pattern that we can't really make guarantees about, so it might be nice to be able to rebuild the context, like have APIs to rebuild the context or refresh it or something like that.
Well, it's kind of like, I think we talked, at one point this summer we talked about the idea of, I think we talked about this, like having kind of a, like, you could upload schematic data into the context rather than your actual data. So you could almost, I mean, you maybe could do it as like a two-step thing where there's like your pre-context or your schematic context, which you use to then do these iterations before you ever actually load up your data into it. And maybe that avoids some of the weirdness of the iteration. I don't know.
Give as many, reduce as many possible settings where you want to try to avoid as many possible settings where you have to rebuild the context just by nice functionality on the context.
Something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
With DP Wizard, there's a lot of complexity, right? Like, it was coming from this tool for data repositories, and there's concern with reproducible research, and so there's the whole notebook generation thing. And so all the really DP stuff happens inside of this generated code, which is a weird architectural decision, but it was motivated by something. Is that generated notebook what you're sort of pointing at is people want to see the effects of their choices there, or is it more like the little bar chart that you see earlier on? Like, do people, when you're sort of saying people want to like preview the effects of their choices, is seeing a graph enough, or is actually showing them the code that they would do really a big value add?
Yeah, so I would say it's more about the visuals of the code.
Okay.
So providing them with, you know, for their you know, auxiliary data set, like tangible, you know, your mean is 100, here's 1,000 draws of what your mean is going to look like coming out of OpenDP. Like that kind of thing. And then again, like, yeah, I think probably the main thing that you would need to change is to make it so that it's like easy to go back and change settings and run it again under different settings, you know, different number of statistics or whatever, so that you can like keep playing around with like different.
And I think that's another thing, like where, like, the design was, okay, we want to encourage people to choose their things and then go on, because if you do it again, then it's sort of another spend, and we didn't block that off entirely, but it's just like you get the warning bar there and stuff.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, that would be the biggest change, I think.
Yeah, so I think at the implementation level, I think everything that we do, like if we decide to add more functionality in here, it sort of has to go down to that code generation thing and then all the way back up. And so that's like just the layers, a lot of complexity, because you can't just like make changes in the OpenDP code, because the OpenDP code is actually down there in a template that's being generated and needs to handle all the different cases that are possible.
Okay.
And so I think if you don't need the code generation, that's not a big part of this story, I think it'd be less scary, more feasible to do a new architecture that doesn't go all the way down to the code generation part.
Yeah, yeah, totally. That's what I would do.
Okay.
I would, whether you call that, you know, DP Wizard 2 or something different.
Okay.
But
yeah.
I mean, I gather from you know what you're saying, that the way you envision someone, say someone's doing these experiments with DP Wizard, they're getting a feeling for what's the impact of various choices. Eventually, when they want to do things get closer to doing things in production, they're going to switch over to using, you know, the context API, and that's a new learning process. And I think one of the reasons the code generation was put there was thinking, okay, now that generated code by DP Wizard, they can see, oh, that's what I was just experimenting with, that's how I would do that in the context API, that's kind of a foothold. But maybe you feel like with the right documentation and tooling, that won't be necessary. And
yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I guess it seems like if you want to keep, you know, this potential new DP Wizard free from people misusing it by uploading their data into it, like it would be hard to connect the code that's generated on some kind of schematic public data with the code you actually need to run on your data. So like even though it's maybe helpful, it might actually end up being more confusing if it's like a slightly different data set or entirely different data set. You see what I'm saying?
got it. But is that also an issue with this pipeline here?
Well, I think, yeah, and I mean maybe the code generated by the DP Wizard is, you know, closer to kind of what I'm envisioning for like the reproducible code repo, right? Where it's like, here's an example of using OpenDP on a public data set. But what it's missing is, I think, kind of the pre-processing and post-processing and like seeing OpenDP in context, you know, in a bigger context. Like the DP Wizard code is only going to give you that middle part. So I don't know. I think my recommendation would probably lean closer to Chuck's thought of like just rebuild it in a simpler frame like architecture, where you don't have to like do this weird down.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is like right now, it's not doing any actually DP stuff until you get all the things. But you could have like little snippets, but you wouldn't be trying to like make those sort of templated snippets the thing that you're trying to run. So you could like, there'd be a little bit of redundancy, but like have something that you're actually calling OpenDP in the code. And then have just like, okay, and here's like the simple bits of template. Like right now there's sort of templates inside of templates, and it gets complicated. The other thing I'm just wondering is, like, depending on how simple the simulation is, going back to whether we can move this into JavaScript. Going through Shiny itself, like I mean, you've looked at it, like Shiny is not the framework that I would choose for everything, but it's an okay framework, and I think it does do well, like just you're doing everything in Python.
Shiny does not play nicely with OpenDP and R, I will say.
Yeah, so
I
this
tried. They don't.
Okay, yeah, this is a Shiny in there's a Python Shiny, so I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
In R, they don't play nicely. So.
I don't even.
I was about that.
Okay.
I was gonna mention, is there like a world where you lazy export? Like right now, there's this idea that you're exporting to run the code, but it could be the case that you choose to export at the end rather than during, and would that reduce the complexity?
It is at the end.
It is at the end only,
Yeah.
so they can do all their iterations
There's
without
this-
generating notebooks in between?
Well, I think this is just like, if you put more, right now you can't really do the iterations because it's not doing the release until the very end when it generates whole notebook.
Yeah, and that's
And
what
so
I
if
was.
you pull that earlier, it's possible, but I think it's also, there's just like the architecture has a lot of complexity that,
Yeah, we can look
scares
into
me, yeah.
making it. I can definitely help look into it. I think for me, lazy exporting, so like exporting being something that you get at the end, but during the process, whatever you land on can run more direct, and then you end up having effectively like a set of things that you did iteratively, and then reading through those is how you generate the last one. Might kind of help reduce this. There's a like notebook as a source of truth that tends to not be very malleable. Notebooks are not malleable at all. But yeah, we can. I mean, definitely, there's a lot of like ways to look into that.
and then there's just a choice of like how much chuck time other resources should go into this project or that project or that project, and that's something like really
Yes, we-
deferring
we-
to you on.
Yeah, so first, thank you, Joshua. Lots of.
Yeah, I mean, I
lots
just
of-
gave you really
lots
like
of stuff for us-
simple, really
lots-
simple
yeah.
things. They'll take no time.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff for us to chew on. And